Part 7, Chapter 3. The Law Today. The reader has seen throughout this book, from the very beginning of the Stalin age, there have been no politicals in our country. The crowds, the millions driven past while you watched, all those millions of 58s, were merely common criminals. Besides, Mary, mouthy Nikita Sergeyevic, took so many bows from so many platforms. Politicals? Not a one. We just don't have them. And as grief grew forgetful, as distance softened craggy contours, as fat formed under the skin, we almost believed it. Even former Zeks did. Millions of Zeks were released for all to see, so perhaps there really were no politicals left. We had returned, others joined us. Our friends and families were back. The gaps in our little world of urban intellectuals seemed to be filled, the ring closed. You could sleep undisturbed, and no one would have been taken from the house when you awoke. Friends would telephone. No one was missing. Not that we altogether believed it, but for practical purposes we accepted that there were no longer any politicals in jail. And Nikita was there, glued to his platform. There can be no return to deeds and occurrences such as these, either in the party or in the country generally. May 22nd, 1959. That was before Novocherkassk. Now everyone in our country can breathe freely, with no need to worry about the present or the future. March 8th, 1963. After Novocherkassk. Novocherkassk, a town of fateful significance in Russia's history. As though the Civil War had not left scars enough, it thrust itself beneath the saber yet again. Novocherkassk, a whole town of rebels, and every trace is licked clean and hidden. Even under Khrushchev, the fog of universal ignorance remained so thick that no one abroad got to know about Novocherkassk. There were no Western broadcasts to inform us of it, and even local rumor was stamped out before it could spread, so that the majority of our fellow citizens do not know what event is associated with the name Novocherkassk, and the date is June 2nd, 1962. Let me then put down here all that I have been able to gather. We can say without exaggeration that this was a turning point in the modern history of Russia. If we leave out the Ivanovo weavers at the beginning of the 30s, theirs was a large-scale strike, but it ended without violence. The flare-up at Novocherkassk was the first time the people had spoken out in 41 years, since Kronstadt and Tambov. Unorganized, leaderless, unpremeditated, it was a cry from the soul of a people who could no longer live as they had lived. On Friday, June 1st, one of those carefully considered enactments of which Khrushchev was so fond of publishing throughout the Union, raising the prices of meat and butter. On that very same day, as demanded by another and quite separate economic plan, piece rates at the huge electric locomotive works in Novocherkassk, NEVZ, were lowered, in some cases by 30%. That morning the workers in two shops, the forge and the foundry, usually obedient creatures of habit, geared to their jobs, could not force themselves to work. So hot had things become for them. Their loud, excited discussions developed into a spontaneous mass meeting, an everyday event in the West, an extraordinary one for us. By noon, the strike had spread throughout the enormous locomotive works. Runners were sent to other factories, where the workers wavered but did not come out in support. The Moscow-Rostov railway line runs close to the works, either to make sure that the news would reach Moscow more quickly, or to prevent troops and tanks from moving in. A large number of women sat down on the tracks to hold up trains, whereupon the men began pulling up the rails and building barriers. Strike action of such boldness is unusual in the history of the Russian workers' movement. Slogans appeared on the works building. Down with Khrushchev! Use Khrushchev for sausage meat. While all this was happening, troops and police began converging on the works. Tanks took up position on the bridge over Tuzlov. From evening until the following morning, movement inside the city or across the bridge was completely forbidden. Even during the night, the workers' settlement did not quiet down for a moment. Overnight, about 30 workers were arrested as ringleaders and carried off to the city police station. On the morning of June 2nd, some other enterprises in the town struck, but by no means all of them. Another spontaneous mass meeting at the NEVZ decided on a protest march into the town to demand the release of the arrested workers. The procession, only about 300 strong to begin with, you had to be brave, with women and children in its ranks, carrying portraits of Lenin and peaceful slogans, marched over the bridge past the tanks without obstruction, then uphill into town. Here their numbers were quickly swelled by curious onlookers, individual workers from other enterprises, and little boys. At several places in the city, people stopped lorries and used them as platforms for speech-making. The whole town was seething. The NEVZ demonstrators marched along the main street, Mostovskaya, and some of them began trying to break down the locked doors of the town police station in the belief that their arrested comrades were inside. They were met with pistol shots. All the streets were choked with people, and here, on the square, the crowd was densest. The party offices were found to be empty. The city authorities had fled to Rostov. It was about 11 a.m. There were no police to be seen in the town, but there were more and more troops. A revealing picture. At the first slight shock, the civil authorities hid behind the army. Soldiers had occupied the post office, the radio station, the bank. By this time, the whole of Novocherkassk was beleaguered, and every entry point and exit barred. Tanks crawled slowly along the Moskovskaya street, following the route demonstrators had taken toward party headquarters. Boys started scrambling onto the tanks and obstructing the observation slits. The tanks fired a few blank shells, rattling the windows of shops and houses along the street. The boys scattered and the tanks crawled on. And the students? Novocherkassk is, of course, a town of students. Where were they all? The students of some institutes, including the Polytechnic and of some technical secondary schools, had been locked in their dormitories or in other school buildings from early morning. Their rectors had thought quickly, but we may as well say it. The students, for their part, showed little civic courage. They were presumably glad of this excuse to do nothing. It would take more than the turn of a key to hold back rebel students in the West today, and took more in Russia in days gone by. A scuffle broke out inside the party building. Step by step, the speakers were dragged back inside, and soldiers emerged onto the balcony, more and more of them. A file of riflemen began forcing the crowd back from the small square immediately before the palace toward the railings of the garden. Several witnesses say unanimously that these soldiers were all non-Russians, Caucasians brought in from the other end of the oblast to replace the cordon from the local garrison previously posted there. But not all witnesses agree that the previous cordon had been ordered to open fire, and that the order was not carried out because the captain who received it killed himself in front of his men rather than pass it on. That an officer committed suicide is beyond doubt, but accounts of the circumstances are vague, and no one knows the name of this hero of conscience. It is not known who gave the order, but these soldiers raised their rifles and fired a first volley over the heads of the crowd. The burst fired over the heads of the crowd and found the trees in the little garden and the boys who had climbed into them, some of whom fell to the ground. The crowd, it seems, gave a roar, whereupon the soldiers, whether at command or because they saw red, or in panic, started firing freely into the crowd, and yes, with dum-dum bullets. Remember Kenjir, the 16 at the guardhouse? The crowd fled in panic, jamming the narrow paths around the garden, but the troops went on firing at their backs as they retreated. Information from a variety of sources is more or less unanimous that some 70 or 80 people were killed. The soldiers looked around for lorries and buses, commandeered them, loaded them with the dead and the wounded, and dispatched them to the high-walled military hospital. For a day or two afterward, these buses went around with blood-stained seats. That day, just as in Kenjir, movie cameras took pictures of the rebels on the streets. The firing ceased, the terror passed, The crowd poured back onto the square, and was fired upon again. All this happened between noon and 1 p.m. This is what an observant witness saw at 2 p.m. There are about 8 tanks of different types standing on the square in front of party headquarters. A cordon of soldiers stands before them. The square is almost deserted. There are only small groups of people, mostly youngsters, standing about and shouting at the soldiers. On the square, puddles of blood have formed in depressions in the pavement. I am not exaggerating. I never suspected till now that there could be so much blood. The benches in the public garden are splattered with blood, and there are bloodstains on its sanded paths and on the whitewashed tree trunks in the public garden. The whole square is scored with tank tracks. A red flag, which the demonstrators had been carrying, is propped against the wall of party headquarters, and a gray cap splashed with red-brown blood has been slung over the top of its pole. Across the facade of the party building hangs a red banner there for some time past. The people and the party are one. People go up to the soldiers, to curse them or to appeal to their conscience. How could you do it? Who did you think you were shooting at? Your own people you were shooting at. They make excuses. We've only just been brought in and posted here. We had nothing to do with it. That's how efficient our murderers are, and yet people talk about bureaucratic sluggishness. He knows his business, that General Pliev. Toward 5 or 6 o'clock, the square gradually filled with people again. They were brave, the people of Novocherkassk. The town radio kept appealing to them. Citizens, do not fall for provocation. Go home quietly. The riflemen still stood there. The blood had not been mopped up, and again they pressed forward. Shouts from the crowd, more and more people, and another impromptu meeting. They knew by now that 6 senior members of the Central Committee had flown in, probably arriving before the first shootings. Among them, needless to say, Mikoyan, the expert on Budapest-type situations, Suslov and Frau Kozlov. A delegation of younger workers from NEVZ was sent to tell them what had happened. A buzz went through the crowd. Let Mikoyan come down here. Let him see all this blood for himself. Mikoyan wouldn't come down, thank you, but a reconnaissance helicopter flew low over the square around 6 o'clock, inspected it, flew off again. Shortly afterward, the workers' delegation came back. The delegates reported to the crowd that they had seen the Central Committee members and told them about this bloody Saturday, and that Kozlov had wept when he heard about the children falling from the trees at the first volley. You know Frau Kozlov, the Leningrad party gang boss, the cruelest of Stalinists? He wept. The Central Committee members had promised to investigate these events and severely punish those responsible. But for the present, everyone must go home to prevent the outbreak of fresh disorders in the town. The meeting, however, did not disperse. The crowd grew ever denser toward the evening, the desperate courage of Novocherkassk. Around 9 in the evening, they tried to drive the people away from the palace with tanks. But as soon as the drivers switched on their engines, people clustered around the tanks, blocking the hatches and the observation slits. The tanks stalled. The riflemen stood by and made no effort to help the tank crews. An hour later, tanks and armored personnel carriers appeared from the opposite side of the square, with an escort of Tommy gunners perched on top of them. At last, toward midnight, the riflemen began firing tracer bullets into the air, and the crowd slowly dispersed. What power there is in a popular disturbance! How quickly it changes the whole political situation! The night before there had been a curfew, and the people had been frightened away, but now the whole town was strolling about and hooting at the soldiers. A people transformed. Can it be so near to breaking through the crust of this half-century into a completely different atmosphere? On June 3rd, the town radio broadcast speeches by Mikoyan and Kozlov. Kozlov did not weep, nor did any of them promise to find the culprits. What they now said was that these events were the result of enemy provocation, and that these enemies would be severely punished. Mikoyan said further that dum-dum bullets had never been adopted as part of the equipment of Soviet troops, and that they must therefore have been used by enemies of the state. But who were these enemies? How had they parachuted into the country? Where were they hiding? Show us just one. We are so used to being treated like fools. Enemies, they say, and all is explained. In the Middle Ages, it was devils. The shops were immediately the richer for the butter, sausage, and many other things not seen in those parts for a long time, or anywhere outside the capitals. The wounded all vanished without a trace. Not one of them went home. Instead, the families of the wounded and the killed, who of course wanted to know what had become of their kin, were deported to Siberia. So were many of those involved in the demonstration who had been noticed or photographed. Some participants were dealt with in a series of trials in camera. There were also 2 public trials, with entry by ticket for factory party officials and for the town apparatchiki. At one of these, 9 men were sentenced to be shot and 2 women to 15 years imprisonment. On the Saturday following Bloody Saturday, the town radio announced that the workers of the electric locomotive works have solemnly undertaken to fulfill their 7-year plan ahead of time. At Alexandrovo in 1961, a year before Novocherkassk, the police beat a man to death while he was under arrest and would not allow his body to be carried past their precinct to the cemetery. The crowd was furious and burned down the police station. Arrests followed immediately. There was a similar incident about the same time in Murom. What would the appropriate charge now be? Under Stalin, even a tailor who stuck a needle in a newspaper could get Article 58. Now a more sensible view was taken. Wrecking a police station should not be regarded as a political act. It was ordinary banditry. Instructions were handed down to this effect. Mass disorders should not be treated as political offenses. If they are not political, what is? So all at once, there were no more politicals. But one stream has never dried up in the USSR and still flows. A stream of criminals untouched by the beneficent wave summoned to life. A stream which flowed uninterruptedly through all those decades, whether Leninist norms were infringed or strictly observed, and flowed in the Khrushchev's day more fiercely than ever. I mean the believers, those who resisted the new wave of cruel persecution, the wholesale closing of churches, monks who were slung out of their monasteries, stubborn sectarians, especially those who refused to perform military service. There's nothing we can do about it. We're really very sorry, but you're directly aiding imperialism. We let you off lightly nowadays. It's 5 years first time around. These are in no sense politicals. They are religionists, but they have to be re-educated. Believers must be dismissed from their jobs merely for their faith. Komsomols must be sent along to break the windows of believers. Believers must be officially compelled to attend anti-religious lectures. Church doors must be cut down with blowtorches. Domes pulled down with hawsers attached to tractors. Gatherings of old women broken up with fire hoses. Is this what you mean by dialogue, French comrades? As the monks of the Pukayev monastery were told in the Soviet of Workers' Deputies, if we always observe Soviet laws, we shall have to wait a long time for communism. Only in extreme cases, when educational methods do not help, is the recourse to law necessary. Here we can dazzle the world with the diamond-pure nobility of our laws today. We no longer try people in closed courts, as under Stalin. We no longer try them in absentia. We try them semi-publicly, that is to say, in the presence of a semi-public. I hold in my hand a record of the trial of some Baptists at Nikitovka in the Donbas in January 1964. This is how it's done. On the pretense that their identity must be checked, the Baptists who arrived to attend the trial were held in jail for 3 days, until the trial was over, and to give them a fright, someone, a free citizen, who threw flowers to the defendants, got 10 days. So did a Baptist who kept a record of the trial, and his notes were taken away. But another record survived. A bunch of hand-picked komsomols were let in before the general public by a side door, so that they could occupy the front rows. While the trial was in progress, there were shouts from the spectators. Pour kerosene over the lot and set fire to them." The court did nothing to curb this righteous indignation. Typical of its procedures, it admitted the evidence of hostile neighbors and also that of terrorized minors. The little girls of 9 and 11 were brought before the court. Who the hell cares what effect it has on them as long as we get our verdict? Their exercise books with texts from the scriptures were introduced as exhibits. One of the defendants, Basby, father of 9 children, was a minor who had never received any support from the Union Committee at his pit because he was a Baptist. But they managed to confuse his daughter Nina, a schoolgirl in the 8th grade, and to suborn her with 50 rubles from the Union Committee and a promise to place her in an institute later on, so that during the investigation she made fantastic statements against her father. He had tried to poison her with a sour fruit drink. When the believers were hiding in the woods for their prayer meetings, because they were persecuted in the settlement, they had a radio transmitter, a tall tree with wire wound all around it. Afterward, these lying statements began to prey on Nina's mind. She became mentally ill and was put in the violent ward of an asylum. Nonetheless, she was produced in court in the expectation that she would stick to her evidence. But she repudiated every word of it. The interrogator dictated what I had to say himself. It made no difference. The shameless judge ignored her latest statements and regarded only her earlier evidence as valid. Whenever depositions favorable to the prosecution come unstuck, this is the typical and regular dodge used by the courts. They ignore what is brought out in court and base themselves on faked evidence obtained in the preliminary investigation. Now, what do you mean by that? It says here in your deposition, you testified during the investigation. What right have you to retract now? That's an offense too, you know. The judge is not at all interested in the substance of the case, in the truth. The Baptists are persecuted because they do not accept preachers sent by an atheist plenipotentiary of the state, but prefer their own. Under Baptist rules, any brother can preach the gospel. There is a directive from the Oblast Party Committee. Put them on trial and forcibly take their children from them, and this will be carried out, although with the left hand the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet has just, July 2, 1962, signed the World Convention on the Fight Against Discrimination in the Sphere of Education. One of its points is that parents must be allowed to provide for the religious and moral education of their children in accordance with their own convictions. But that is precisely what we cannot allow. Anyone who speaks in court on the substance of the case, anyone who tries to clarify the issue, is invariably interrupted, diverted from his train of thought, deliberately confused by the judge, who conducts the debate on this level. How can you talk about the end of the world when we are committed to the building of communism? This is from the closing statement made by one young girl, Zhenya Klopanina. Instead of going to the cinema or to dances, I used to read the Bible and say my prayers, and just for that you are taking my freedom from me. Yes, to be free is a great happiness, but to be free from sin is a greater still. Lenin said that only in Turkey and Russia did such shameful phenomena as religious persecution still exist. I've never been in Turkey and know nothing about it, but how things are in Russia you can see for yourselves. She was cut short. The sentences. 2 of them got 5 years in the camps, 2 of them 4 years, and Basby, the father of all those children, got 3. The defendants accepted their sentences joyfully and said a prayer. The representatives from enterprises shouted, "Not long enough, make it more," throw kerosene over them and put a match to it. The long-suffering Baptists took note and kept count, and set up a council of prisoners' relatives, which began issuing manuscript bulletins about all the persecutions. From these bulletins we learn that from 1961 to June 1964, 197 Baptists were condemned, 15 of them women. They are all listed by name. Prisoners' dependents, now left without means of support, have also been counted, 442, of whom 341 are under school age. The majority get 5 years of exile, but some get 5 years in a strict regime camp. narrowly escaping the hardened criminal's motley, with 3 to 5 years in exile in addition. B.M. Zorovets from Olshiny in Kharkov Oblast got 7 years of strict regime for his faith. A 76-year-old, Y.V. Erend, was put inside, as were the whole Lozovoy family, father, mother, and son. Yevgeny M. Sorokin, a Group 1, disabled veteran of the Fatherland War, blind in both eyes, was condemned in the village of Sokolovo, Zimyevsk district. Kharkov Oblast to 3 years in a camp for bringing up his children, Lubya, Nadia, and Raya, as Christians, and they were taken away from him by order of the court. The court trying the Baptist M.I. Brodovsky at Nikolaev, October 6, 1966, was not too squeamish to use crudely faked documents. When the defendant protested, "This is dishonest of you," they barked back at him, "The law will crush you, smash you, destroy you." The law, my friend, not one of your acts of extrajudicial vengeance, as practiced in the years when norms were still observed. We recently got to know S. Karavansky's soul-chilling petition, which was transmitted from a camp to the outside world. The author had been sentenced to 25 years, had served 16 of them, 1944 to 1960, had been released, evidently under the 2/3 rule, had been married, had begun a university course, but no, in 1965 they came for him again. Get yourself ready, you still have 9 years to go. Where else is this possible? Under what other code of law on earth except ours? There are quite a few people like this. People who were not affected by the epidemic of releases under Khrushchev, the teammates, cellmates, transit prison acquaintances whom we left behind. We have long ago forgotten them in our new lives, but they still shuffle hopelessly, drearily, numbly about the same little patches of trampled earth, with the same watchtowers and barbed wire fences all around them. The faces on the papers change. The speeches from the platforms change. People fight against the cult and then stop fighting. But then the 25-year prisoners, Stalin's godchildren, are still inside. Karavansky cites the blood-freezing prison careers of several such people. All you freedom-loving left-wing thinkers in the West, you left laborites, you progressive American, German, and French students, as far as you are concerned, none of this amounts to much. As far as you are concerned, this whole book of mine is a waste of effort. You may suddenly understand it all some day, but only when you yourselves hear, "Hands beneath your backs there," and step ashore on our archipelago. Still, there is really no comparison between the numbers of political prisoners now and in Stalin's time, and they are no longer counted in the millions or the hundreds of thousands. Is this because the law has been reformed? It is just that the ship has changed course, for a time. We call this chapter The Law Today. It should rightly be called There Is No Law. The same treacherous secrecy, the same fog of injustice, still hangs in our air, worse than the smoke of the city chimneys. For half a century and more the enormous state has towered over us, girded with hoops of steel. The hoops are still there. There is no law. End of Part 7, Chapter 3. End of the Gulag Archipelago Abridged.